London is a city built on bones. Right now, underneath the glass towers, the coffee shops, the underground trains rushing through tunnels, there is another city. Older. Darker. Soaked in blood and fire and plague. A city where executions were public entertainment, where rivers ran with sewage and disease, where the line between life and death was so thin that people prayed every single morning just to make it through the day. This is the story of medieval London. And I promise you, by the time we are done here, you will never look at this city the same way again. Most people think of London as a modern city. The red buses, the Thames, the gleaming skyline. But that city is only a few hundred years old. The London we are going to explore tonight existed for centuries before any of that. It was loud, it was filthy, it was violent, it was alive in a way that modern cities simply are not. People were born, lived, suffered, and died all within a few square miles. And the things that happened in those miles shaped everything that came after. We are going to walk through this city together. We will stand on London Bridge and look up at the severed heads rotting on spikes. We will push through the crowds at Cheapside Market, smell the meat and the mud and the unwashed bodies. We will stand in the shadow of the Tower of London and think about what it felt like to know you were never coming out. And at the end, we will watch the whole thing burn. So take a breath. And let us begin. Part 1. The city within the walls. Medieval London was small by our standards. Almost unimaginably small. The entire city fit within a rough square mile on the north bank of the Thames. The walls that the Romans had built centuries earlier still stood, defining exactly where London began and ended. If you lived inside those walls, you were a Londoner. If you lived outside, you were something else entirely. The population varied wildly across the centuries. In the 1300s, before the plague, London had perhaps 80,000 people. That is less than a mid-sized town today. But pack 80,000 people into 1 square mile of narrow lanes, wooden buildings, and open sewers, and you create a density of human experience that is almost impossible to imagine. You were never alone. You could hear your neighbor breathing through the walls. You could smell the tanneries 3 streets away. The city was a living organism, and every single person was part of it whether they wanted to be or not. The streets themselves were nothing like what you see today. They were narrow, unpaved, and permanently wet. There were no pavements. There were no gutters in the modern sense. Waste was simply thrown into the street. Human waste, animal waste, scraps from kitchens, blood from butchers. The city employed men called rakers whose entire job was to try to keep the streets clear, but they were always fighting a losing battle. The smell must have been extraordinary. Visitors from outside England often commented on it. Even Londoners who had grown up in the city seemed to have accepted it as simply the way things were. The buildings pressed in on both sides of these streets, and they were built upward because land was so precious. Each floor of a building overhung the one below it, so that by the time you got to the top of a 4 or 5-story building, the upper floors of houses on opposite sides of the street were almost touching. This meant that in the narrowest lanes, sunlight almost never reached the ground. Even in summer, there were parts of medieval London that were always in shadow. And then at night, those shadows became something else entirely. There were no street lights. There was no police force. If you needed to be outside after dark, you carried a candle or a torch, and you stayed alert, because the darkness of a medieval city at night was total and it was dangerous. Robbery was common. Murder was not unusual. The city watch existed, but their reach was limited and their reliability was questionable. This was the world that Londoners navigated every single day. And yet people chose to live here. They came from the countryside, from France, from Italy, from the Jewish communities of Europe. They came because London had something that nowhere else in England could offer. It had opportunity. It had trade. It had the river. Part 2. The Thames, the river that made everything possible. You cannot understand medieval London without understanding the Thames. The river was not just a backdrop. It was the reason the city existed at all. Everything that London was, everything it became, came from the water. The Thames in the medieval period was wider and shallower than it is today. Its banks were marshy in places, and at certain times of year it flooded the lower parts of the city. But it was also the most important highway in England. Goods from across Europe arrived by ship. Wool went out. Wine came in. Spices, silk, furs, timber, salt, grain. The entire commercial life of the kingdom flowed through the Thames and through the docks and wharves of London. The river was alive with boats. Wherries, the water taxis of their day, carried passengers up and down the river for a penny or two. Larger vessels brought cargo from deep water anchorages downstream. Fishermen worked the shallows. On hot summer days, people swam in it, though the water was increasingly filthy as the city grew. The Thames received the outflow of every drain and sewer in London, but it also flushed itself twice a day with the tides, and people seemed to believe that this made it reasonably safe. The bridge was the point where all of this came together. London Bridge was one of the great engineering achievements of the medieval world, and it was unlike anything you have seen before. Part 3. London Bridge, a city on a bridge. London Bridge was not just a bridge. It was a street. It was a neighborhood. It was a city on top of a river, and it was one of the most extraordinary things in medieval Europe. The bridge that most people picture when they think of medieval London was built in stone beginning around 1176 and took 30 years to complete. It stretched roughly 900 feet across the Thames, supported by 19 arches, and it was covered from one end to the other with buildings. Houses, shops, chapels. At its peak, perhaps 200 buildings stood on the bridge, some of them rising to 6 or 7 stories. There was even a drawbridge section that could be raised to let tall ships through, and to defend the city if needed. To walk across London Bridge was to walk through a crowded, noisy, smelly, extraordinary marketplace. Merchants sold everything from bread to cloth to weapons. People lived their entire lives in those buildings, born above the river, raised above the river, married and buried within earshot of the water rushing between the starlings below. The bridge was so important, so central to everything, that it had its own administrative system, its own revenues, its own maintenance crew. And then there was what happened at the Southwark Gate. At the southern end of the bridge, above the gatehouse, heads were displayed on spikes. The heads of traitors, rebels, and criminals who had been executed by the crown. Preserved in tar to make them last longer, they stood as a warning to everyone who entered or left the city. You would look up and you would see them. The faces were recognizable for a while, and then they were not, and eventually they were just skulls staring down at the traffic below. This was completely normal to the people who lived there. It was not considered gruesome in the way we would consider it. It was considered justice. It was considered necessary. The display of executed traitors was a statement of power, a reminder of what happened to those who challenged the king. And Londoners walked past it every day on their way to work. The bridge was also a bottleneck. At busy times, crossing could take an hour or more. Carts and animals and pedestrians all competed for the same narrow road. Fights broke out. Accidents happened. People fell. The river below was fast and cold, and the gaps between the buildings meant that in winter, the wind cut through with brutal force. But people loved the bridge. It was the heart of the city in many ways. And when it was threatened, Londoners defended it with everything they had. Part 4. The Tower of London, where power lived and people died. If the bridge was the heart of medieval London, the tower was its iron fist. Built by William the Conqueror after the Norman invasion of 1066, the Tower of London was a statement. It said, "The new king is here. The new king is powerful. And if you doubt that, come a little closer." The original structure was the White Tower, a massive stone keep that still stands at the center of the complex today. Over the following centuries, additional walls and towers were added, creating the concentric fortification that we recognize now. The tower served many purposes. It was a royal residence. It was an armory. It was a treasury. It was a zoo, housing lions, elephants, and a polar bear given as a royal gift. But it was also a prison, and that is the role that history remembers most vividly. People sent to the tower did not always come back. Some were held there for years, in conditions that ranged from comfortable to horrific depending on who they were and what the king wanted from them. Noble prisoners might be housed in relatively decent apartments with servants and access to the gardens. Common prisoners and those accused of the most serious crimes faced something very different. The dungeons of the tower were not pleasant places, and the instruments of torture they contained were used. The executions on Tower Hill, just outside the walls, were public events. People came to watch. They brought their children. They bought food from vendors and found good spots to see. This was not considered barbaric. It was considered entertainment, justice, and civic education all at once. The message was clear: this is what happens to traitors. Some of the most famous figures in English history spent their last days within these walls. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was arrested, tried, and beheaded here in 1536. She was accused of adultery and treason, charges that most modern historians believe were fabricated. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the tower, her body placed in an arrow chest because no proper coffin had been prepared. Thomas More, the scholar and statesman who refused to acknowledge Henry as the head of the Church of England, was held in the tower before his execution in 1535. By all accounts, he was remarkably composed throughout his imprisonment, writing and praying and maintaining the intellectual clarity that had defined his life. He was beheaded on Tower Hill, and reportedly told the executioner that his beard had done nothing to deserve being cut. But the tower held darker secrets than even these famous stories. In 1483, the two young sons of King Edward IV disappeared into the tower and were never seen again. They became known as the Princes in the Tower, and their fate has never been definitively established. Were they murdered? If so, by whom? Was it their Uncle Richard, who became Richard III? Was it someone else? Bones found beneath a staircase in the tower in 1674 were thought to be theirs, but the evidence was never conclusive. The mystery remains one of the most debated in English history. The tower was never just a building. It was a symbol. It was a place where the power of kings was made physical. And for the people of medieval London, it was always there, always visible, always a reminder that authority in this world was real and it was final. Part 5. The streets of the city, life in the medieval lanes away from the great monuments. Medieval London was a maze of lanes and alleys, markets and churches, taverns and workshops. The street names alone tell a story. Bread Street, where bakers sold their goods. Milk Street, where dairy was traded. Poultry for the bird sellers. Ironmonger Lane. Wood Street. Friday Street, where fish was sold on the Christian day of abstinence. The city organized itself by trade, and the trades organized themselves by street, and the result was a kind of order within the apparent chaos. The markets were the lifeblood of the city. Cheapside was the main commercial artery, a wide street by medieval standards, running east to west through the heart of London. Here you could buy almost anything. Cloth from the Low Countries. Spices from the east. Jewelry, metalwork, leather goods. The Cheapside Cross stood at the western end, one of the Eleanor crosses erected by Edward I in memory of his wife, and it served as a kind of landmark, a meeting point, a place for announcements and proclamations. Smithfield, just outside the city walls to the north, was where the livestock market was held. Cattle, sheep, pigs, horses. The smell was tremendous. The noise was constant. And Smithfield had another use as well. It was one of the main sites for public executions and burnings. William Wallace, the Scottish freedom fighter, was executed at Smithfield in 1305 with a brutality that was extraordinary even by the standards of the time. He was hanged, cut down while still alive, disemboweled, and then beheaded and quartered. His body parts were sent to different parts of the kingdom as a warning. This was not considered extreme. This was considered appropriate for a traitor. Part 6. St. Paul's Cathedral, the soul of the city. The old St. Paul's Cathedral that stood in medieval London was not the building you see today. Sir Christopher Wren's magnificent Baroque cathedral was built after the Great Fire of 1666. The medieval St. Paul's was something different entirely. It was enormous, one of the largest Gothic cathedrals in Europe, with a spire that was, for a time, the tallest in the world at around 489 feet. It dominated the skyline of London the way the modern cathedral still does, but in a city of low wooden buildings, it must have been absolutely overwhelming. The cathedral was not just a place of worship. It was a social center, a marketplace, a gathering place for the entire city. The nave of St. Paul's, known as Paul's Walk, was used as a thoroughfare. People walked through it to get from one part of the city to another. Merchants conducted business there. Lawyers met their clients. News was exchanged. Servants stood looking for employment. Books were sold in the churchyard outside. The boundary between the sacred and the commercial was very thin in medieval London, and nowhere was this more visible than at St. Paul's. The cathedral also served as the location for announcements and proclamations. When the king wanted the city to know something, when a bishop wanted to issue a warning, when the civic authorities had news to share, they did it from the steps of St. Paul's. The whole city would gather, pressing in to hear what was being said, because in a world without newspapers or broadcast media, this was how information moved. The medieval cathedral had problems that the authorities struggled with constantly. The roof was in poor condition for much of its history, requiring repeated expensive repairs. The interior was crowded and noisy. There were persistent complaints about the behavior of those using the nave for commercial purposes. Bishops issued warnings, synods passed regulations, and none of it really worked because the cathedral was simply too central to the life of the city to be kept purely sacred. And then the spire was struck by lightning in 1561 and burned. The fire spread through the roof of the nave, and though the walls survived, the cathedral was never fully restored. It limped on, damaged and diminished, until the Great Fire finally finished it off more than a century later. Part 7. The Plague. When death came for everyone in 1348, something arrived in London that no wall, no tower, no king, no prayer could stop. The Black Death came to England in the summer of that year, carried by ships from the continent, and by the time it was done, it had killed somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of England. London was hit with particular force because of its density. Those 80,000 people packed into a square mile were perfectly positioned for disease to spread. There was no understanding of germ theory. Nobody knew what caused the plague. The prevailing theories ranged from bad air, which was actually not entirely wrong in the sense that proximity to the sick was dangerous, to divine punishment, to the movements of the planets. The Jewish communities of Europe were blamed and massacred in many cities, though England had already expelled its Jewish population in 1290, so London was spared that particular horror. The death toll was staggering. Mass graves were opened outside the city walls to accommodate the bodies. Normal burial rites were impossible to maintain. Priests were dying along with their congregations. The administration of the city was disrupted. The economy was thrown into chaos. The smell of the city, never pleasant, became something that contemporaries described in terms of pure horror. And yet London survived. The city recovered, partially, and then was hit again. The plague returned in 1361, and again in 1368, and again several more times throughout the following century. Each time, it killed people and disrupted society, and each time, the survivors rebuilt and continued. The effect on the labor market was significant. With so many workers dead, those who survived could demand better wages and conditions. This was one of the factors that contributed to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when thousands of people marched on London demanding an end to the feudal system. Part 8. The Guildhall and the Merchants, where money and power met. The Guildhall, which still stands in the city of London today though heavily rebuilt, was the administrative heart of the city. This was where the mayor and aldermen conducted the business of governance, where justice was dispensed, where the civic life of London was organized and managed. The guilds that gave the Guildhall its name were among the most powerful institutions in medieval London. They were trade associations, but they were far more than that. The guilds controlled who could practice a trade within the city, set standards for quality and price, trained apprentices, supported their members in sickness and old age, and wielded enormous political influence. To be a member of a major guild was to be part of the economic, and social elite of London. The great guilds, the mercers, the grocers, the drapers, the fishmongers, the goldsmiths, controlled enormous wealth and operated almost like small governments within the city. Their halls were magnificent buildings filled with plate and tapestry and records of centuries of commerce. Their members were the men who lent money to kings, who financed military campaigns, who connected England to the trade networks of Europe. But the guilds also had a darker side. They were deeply exclusionary. Women were largely kept out. Foreigners, known as aliens, could work in London but faced restrictions. The guilds protected their members by limiting competition, which was good for the members but could be frustrating for everyone else. Tensions between the guilds and between guild members and outsiders were a constant feature of London life. Richard Whittington, who became the legendary Dick Whittington of the pantomime tradition, was real. He was a mercer, a merchant in fine cloth, who became enormously wealthy and served as mayor of London 4 times in the late 1300s and early 1400s. He was famous in his own time for his generosity, funding public works including a public lavatory, which was genuinely needed, and a ward at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. His cat, the central character of the legend, is probably fictional, but the man himself was a towering figure in the civic life of the city. Part 9. Faith in the Church. When God was everywhere, medieval London was saturated with religion. There were over 100 parish churches within the city walls, so many that it seems almost incredible. In a square mile, 100 churches. You were never more than a few hundred yards from a place of worship. The church bells of London rang constantly, marking the hours of prayer, the festivals of the calendar, the deaths and marriages of parishioners. The church was not a separate institution that people visited on Sundays. It was woven into every aspect of daily life. The calendar was organized around the church year. Work was suspended on feast days, of which there were many. The guilds were organized around patron saints. Hospitals were run by religious orders. Education was provided by the church. The poor were supposed to be cared for by the church, though the scale of poverty in medieval London often overwhelmed these provisions. The monasteries and friaries of London played a significant role in the city's life. The great religious houses, Blackfriars, Whitefriars, the Priory of St. John, held extensive properties within and around the city. They provided hospitality to travelers, ran schools, copied manuscripts, brewed ale, and managed large agricultural estates outside the city. They were economic and spiritual powerhouses, and their dissolution by Henry VIII in the 1530s was one of the most disruptive events in the history of London. Heresy was a serious matter in medieval London. Those who held beliefs that the Church considered dangerous could be tried, and if convicted and unrepentant, burned at the stake. Smithfield was one of the main sites for these burnings, and they drew large crowds. The Lollards, followers of the reformer John Wycliffe who questioned aspects of Catholic doctrine, were particularly targeted from the late 1300s onward. Their executions were public and terrible, and they did not stop the spread of reformist ideas. Part 10. Westminster Hall and the Law. Justice in a brutal age. A little distance from the city walls, connected to London but separate from it, Westminster was where royal government lived. The Palace of Westminster, Westminster Hall, and Westminster Abbey formed a complex that was the center of English royal power. Westminster Hall, which still stands today as part of the Houses of Parliament, was one of the largest medieval halls in Europe. Built by William Rufus, the son of the Conqueror, and substantially rebuilt by Richard II at the end of the 14th century with its magnificent hammer-beam roof, the hall served as the main venue for royal courts, feasts, and ceremonies. It was here that the coronation banquets were held. It was here that great state trials took place. The law that operated in medieval London was a complex mixture of royal justice, church courts, and guild regulations. The Court of King's Bench, which met at Westminster, handled serious criminal cases. The Court of Common Pleas dealt with civil matters. The ecclesiastical courts handled cases involving the clergy, marriage, and wills. And within the city itself, the mayor's court and the sheriff's courts had their own jurisdictions. Punishment was physical and public. Fines existed, but for serious crimes, the punishment involved the body. whipping at the cart's tail through the streets. Branding. Mutilation, the cutting off of ears or hands. The pillory, where offenders were locked in a frame in a public place and subjected to whatever the crowd felt like throwing at them. And for the most serious crimes, hanging, beheading, or burning. The law distinguished between types of criminal, and the distinctions mattered enormously. A man who stole goods worth more than 12 pence could be hanged. A first offender who could read might claim benefit of clergy, which originally meant that literate people were church members and subject to church rather than royal courts, and this could save a life. Benefit of clergy was eventually extended and modified in various ways, but it remained a feature of the legal system for centuries. Part 11. The Great Fire approaches. London under pressure. By the middle of the 17th century, medieval London was in trouble. The city had grown massively, far beyond its old walls, into sprawling suburbs to the east and west. The population had climbed to perhaps 500,000. The old wooden buildings that had served well enough in the 13th century were now a city planner's nightmare, packed tightly together, full of flammable materials, serviced by narrow lanes that would make evacuation or fire fighting almost impossible. The authorities were not unaware of the danger. After fires in previous centuries, there had been calls to rebuild in stone. There had been regulations about construction materials, about the storage of flammable goods, about the need for water supplies. None of it had been properly enforced. It was too expensive, too disruptive, too difficult to impose on a city that had always built and wood because wood was what was available and affordable. The great institutions of the old city, the guilds, the livery companies, the church establishments, were still there. But the city had also changed. The Reformation had dissolved the monasteries and transformed the church. The civil wars of the 1640s had torn the country apart. Charles II had been restored to the throne in 1660, but the country was still fragile, still recovering, still finding its way. London in 1666 was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And the spark came from a bakery on Pudding Lane. Part 12. The Great Fire of London, the end of the medieval city. In the early hours of Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1666, a fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the eastern part of the city. The summer had been exceptionally dry. The wooden buildings were parched. A strong easterly wind was blowing. Within hours, what might have been a contained incident became a catastrophe. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken with the news. His response was dismissive. He reportedly said that a woman could piss it out, turned around, and went back to bed. This may be unfair to him, because the early stages of the fire did not immediately suggest the scale of what was coming. But the delay in organizing a response allowed the fire to take hold in a way that made it impossible to stop through normal means. By dawn, the fire was spreading rapidly westward, driven by the wind. The buildings of the old city, the medieval houses with their overhanging stories and their dry timbers, were perfect fuel. Fire breaks, areas where buildings were demolished to create gaps the fire could not cross, were ordered, but were too slow to organize and too limited in scope. The water supply, such as it was overwhelmed. For 4 days the fire burned. It swept through the old city, destroying street after street, landmark after landmark. Cheapside burned. The medieval Guildhall burned. The old St. Paul's Cathedral, already damaged and weakened, was destroyed. The flames were so intense that they melted the lead of the cathedral roof, which ran in streams down the street. The stones of the building cracked and exploded in the heat. Londoners fled with what they could carry. The Thames was packed with boats loaded with furniture and goods. The fields outside the city were covered with people camping among their rescued possessions. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, watched from a boat on the river and described the fire as an arch of flames stretching from one end of the city to the other. John Evelyn, another diarist, walked through the ruins afterward and described a scene of total devastation, a vast, sad, desolate wilderness. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Approximately 13,200 houses destroyed. 87 parish churches gone. The Guildhall, Custom House, the Royal Exchange, the city's prisons. Over 370 acres within the city walls, and another 60 outside. Perhaps 100,000 people left homeless, though the death toll was surprisingly low. Only 6 deaths are confirmed in the contemporary records, though the actual number may have been higher, particularly among the poor whose deaths went unrecorded. Was it an accident? Almost certainly. But in the panicked aftermath, people looked for someone to blame. Catholics were accused of deliberately starting the fire. A French watchmaker named Robert Hubert confessed to starting it, was convicted, and hanged, though it later emerged that he had not even arrived in England until 2 days after the fire started. His confession was false, obtained under pressure, and his execution was a miscarriage of justice. The monument erected to commemorate the fire included an inscription blaming Catholics, which remained until 1830. Part 13: What the Fire Left Behind, and What Came After. When the smoke cleared, medieval London was gone. The city that had grown organically over centuries, layer upon layer of history pressed into a square mile, had been erased in 4 days. What was left were the foundations and the memories. Sir Christopher Wren drew up plans for a completely new city. A rational, planned city with wide straight streets and grand public squares. It was never built, at least not in the way he envisioned. Londoners were impatient. They wanted their city back. They rebuilt on the old street patterns, the old lanes, the old alignments. But this time, they rebuilt in brick and stone. The new London that rose from the ashes was the London of the 17th and 18th centuries, which itself became the foundation of the modern city. Wren did build his cathedral. The new St. Paul's, finished in 1710, rose on the same site as the old one. Its dome dominated the London skyline for centuries, and it still does. Wren also rebuilt dozens of the parish churches that had been destroyed, each one different, each one a masterpiece of design, and many of them still stand. But underneath all of this, the medieval city is still there. Archaeological investigations in London regularly uncover it. Roman walls, Norman stonework, medieval pottery and coins and bones and tools. The ground beneath London is a library of the city's entire history. Every time a building is demolished and a new one constructed, archaeologists move in and document what they find before it is covered over again. The Thames still runs past the site of the old bridge. The Tower of London still stands, impervious to fire and time, its walls as solid today as they were when Edward I finished extending them in the late 13th century. Westminster Hall still has its medieval hammer beam roof, a survivor of everything that time and accident have thrown at it. And the stories are still there too. The stories of the people who lived and died in that square mile, who built London into something extraordinary through centuries of effort and suffering and ingenuity. The merchants and the beggars, the kings and the condemned, the plague survivors and the fire victims. They made the city that made the country that made the modern world. Closing. What medieval London means to us now. You have just walked through nearly 400 years of history. You have stood on London Bridge and looked up at the spikes. You have pushed through the crowds at Cheapside. You have felt the shadow of the tower. You have watched the fire. And now you know what most people who visit London today do not know, that the city under their feet is not the city they see. That every street is built on another street. That every building covers another building. That the ground itself is saturated with history. Medieval London was brutal. It was unequal and violent and full of disease and death and injustice. We should not romanticize it. But it was also extraordinary. The people who lived there were not simpler than us or stupider than us. They were people trying to make sense of an uncertain world with the tools they had. They built institutions that have lasted 1,000 years. They created traditions and practices and laws that we still live with today. They made something that survived plague and fire and war and revolution, and that is still here, still alive, still growing. That is what cities do. They survive. They absorb catastrophe and they rebuild. And sometimes, in the rebuilding, they become something better than what came before. London is a ghost city. But the ghosts are not frightening. They are fascinating. And if you listen closely enough, walking through those old streets, past the tower and the cathedral and the bridge, you can almost hear them. The question is not whether medieval London is gone. The question is whether we have the imagination to see what is still there. I think we do,